the invisible brain of the cartel, who said I work for my cousin, I work for myself. That phrase, seemingly casual, held a truth that very few understood in time. Because in the history of the Medellín Cartel, all the spotlights pointed to one single name, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. But while the whole world spoke of the Patrón del Mal, behind the curtain moved a key figure, silent, lethal, essential. A man who, without wielding weapons or appearing in the press, built the real cocaine empire. His name, Gustavo Gaviria, the financial architect, the invisible brain, the strategist who made the impossible possible. Gustavo de Jesús Gaviria Rivero was born on the 25th of December 1946 in Pereira, the capital of the Colombian department of Risaralda. His family tree was intertwined with that of one of the most feared men of the 20th century. His mother, María Julia Rivero, was the sister of Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrío, mother of Pablo Escobar. That made them cousins, but their bond was much deeper. They grew up together, they thought together, they committed crimes together. From a very young age, they developed a shared vision: to get rich at all costs, without rules, without breaks, without scruples. Gustavo's childhood unfolded in an environment that contrasted with the image he would later project. He was a quiet, observant child, with refined manners and a calculating gaze. When his family moved to Envigado, a town on the outskirts of Medellin, his fate became even more closely tied to that of Pablo Escobar. There, the two cousins began to walk the same path, that of limitless ambition. Unlike Pablo, who from an early age sought notoriety and power, Gustavo chose the shadows. While Escobar built his image as a paisa Robin Hood, handing out money in poor neighborhoods, his cousin bet on invisibility. He never gave interviews, he never attended public meetings. He did not seek cameras, tributes, or recognition. It was something else for him: silent control, the meticulous design of a financial machine that would transform drug trafficking into a global industry. But who was Gustavo Gaviria really? What role did he play in the rise of the Medellín Cartel? And why has his figure remained, to this day, almost anonymous? This is the story of the man who never fired a gun, but who sustained, like an invisible titan, one of the most powerful criminal empires in modern history. A strategist without a face, a lion without a roar. And we are only just beginning. The art of being invisible. While Pablo Escobar advanced toward notoriety with giant steps, building neighborhoods, financing soccer teams, and appearing in newspapers as an almost mythical figure, his cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, walked the opposite path. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Gustavo cultivated an absolutely discreet profile. He was the antithesis of the media kingpin. He never sought spotlights. He never gave an interview. He even avoided social gatherings with figures from the political or business world. He was invisible by choice. Silent, methodical, implacably calculating. From an early age, Gustavo demonstrated an unusual talent for mathematics. His mind was a precision machine. While others thought about distribution routes, shipments, or territorial control, he thought about balances, financial movements, and how to hide millions of dollars under seemingly legal structures. He was more interested in accounting books than guns, more in banks than hitmen, more in numbers than blood. That was always his advantage. While everyone else saw drug trafficking as a game of armed power, he treated it as a business. And as such, he managed it with the coldness of a banker and the efficiency of a Swiss accountant. In private, Gustavo was a refined hedonist. Not a vulgar spender, but a lover of detail, of select luxury. He collected Swiss watches, not to show them off, but out of pure mechanical fascination. He had a cellar of carefully catalogued European wines. He drove high-end cars, some brought directly from Europe, and on the walls of his houses hung pieces of modern art, acquired through discreet auctions or via frontmen. All of this far from the spotlight, without public eccentricities, without ostentatious mansions visible from the air. But if there was one passion that connected him with adrenaline, it was motorsports. At the end of the 1,970 seconds, Gaviria became an amateur driver. He participated in the Renault Cup, one of the most important racing competitions in Colombia at the time, at the Tocancipá circuit, on the outskirts of Bogotá. His car bore the number 71 and was sponsored by a supposedly legal business, Depósitos Cundinamarca. But behind the wheel and beneath the logos, another truth was hidden. That sponsorship was a facade, one of the many mechanisms created by Gaviria to launder money from drug trafficking. On the track, speed was at play. In his accounting books, the empire was at stake. Gustavo was 3 years older than Pablo Escobar. He was born in December 1946, while his cousin came into the world on the 1st of December 1949. But that chronological difference never determined who held more power. Both shared power, each in his own way. Pablo dominated political alliances, controlled the hitmen, and negotiated territories with blood. Gustavo, on the other hand, designed the routes of money, invested in real estate, moved capital through encrypted accounts abroad, and built a legal and financial network that turned the Medellín Cartel into a multinational of crime. For the eyes of the world, the cartel was synonymous with violence, bombs, and assassinations. But behind closed doors, those who truly knew its structure understood something different. Power did not lie only in weapons. Power was in the accounts, and those accounts had a single owner, Gustavo Gaviria. In the next part, we will reveal how a meticulous young man went from minor smuggling to weaving the financial structure of an organization that moved billions of dollars a year without leaving a trace, from minor business to the invisible empire. The age difference between Gustavo Gaviria and Pablo Escobar never translated into hierarchy. In the world of the Medellín Cartel, leadership was a game of chess, not of seniority. And both moved key pieces from different boards, but perfectly synchronized. Pablo ruled with fire, Gustavo with calculation. Escobar was the visible face, an aggressive negotiator, a public figure, the architect of alliances with politicians, paramilitaries, and common criminals. His power rested on fear and the loyalty he knew how to impose through violence. Gustavo, on the other hand, never needed to raise his voice. His control was exercised from the shadows, designing a financial system that allowed millions of dollars to be laundered without raising suspicion. While shipments crossed the northern border, Gustavo had already defined the destinations of the money. Real estate investments in Colombia, Panama, and the United States. Front companies dedicated to export and import. Bank deposits in encrypted accounts in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Caribbean. Frontmen trained to act as legitimate businessmen. Every dollar had a dirty origin, but also a clean path. And that path was built by Gustavo. The magnitude of the business exceeded the imaginable. At its peak, the Medellín Cartel controlled nearly 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. And that figure was not achieved with guns or shipments alone. It was achieved because there was a solid economic infrastructure, perfectly designed and monitored by Gaviria. Every transaction, every payment to pilots, bribes to officials, purchase of laboratories, or reinvestment of profits was recorded with a precision that left no margin for error. For many, Gustavo was just a partner. But in reality, he was the central gear of the entire machine. But before becoming the financial brain of the cartel, Gustavo walked alongside Pablo on the path of minor crimes. Crimes that, modest as they seemed, already revealed a cold, audacious mind willing to cross any limit. One of their first illegal businesses was as grotesque as it was ingenious. They stole marble tombstones from cemeteries, erased the inscriptions with acid, and resold them as new. A macabre operation that marked his entry into the world of crime. Then came other, more profitable activities, smuggling household appliances and cigarettes in a black market that moved large sums in the popular neighborhoods of Medellin. They soon became involved in the theft and resale of automobiles, altering serial numbers and forging documents to give them the appearance of legality. They were even linked to minor robberies of banks and commercial establishments, although their direct participation in each of them was never proven. However, the turning point came when they decided to engage in a harsher form of financing: the extortionate kidnapping of merchants. It was a high-risk crime, but also one of immediate benefits. They identified targets with economic power, abducted them, and demanded exorbitant sums for their release. Payments were quick, complaints were scarce, and the money flowed. That faceless, brutal phase allowed the cousins to accumulate their first significant capital. With that money, they began to weave the network that would soon turn them into the leading cocaine traffickers of the hemisphere. Gustavo was no longer just the Patrón's cousin. He was becoming the banker of crime. While Pablo sharpened his influence in the streets and in politics, Gustavo was weaving something even more dangerous: a parallel economy that would infiltrate banks, businesses, governments, and borders. Birth of an empire. In 1971, Colombia still could not grasp what was about to come. But in the shadows, a violent and silent transformation was already brewing. One of the first signs came with a crime that shocked Medellin: the kidnapping and subsequent murder of Diego Echavarría Misas, one of the most respected industrialists, philanthropist, businessman, and influential figure of the Aburrá Valley. It was a surgical strike, carefully executed, with a clear objective: money. Echavarría's death was not just a tragedy. It was a declaration of ambition. The perpetrators, still far from being recognized as the masters of drug trafficking, were already showing the coldness with which they would operate in the years to come. And although the accusation was never formally established in court, the evidence pointed directly to the Gaviria and Escobar cousins as the intellectual authors. That same year, the criminal compass began to turn. Kidnapping as a source of income had its limits. It was profitable, yes, but dangerous, visible, and far too unstable. Then came the real strategic shift: cocaine. By the mid-1970s, Gustavo and Pablo undertook several trips to the south of the continent, first Peru, then Bolivia. The objective was clear: to acquire coca base paste directly from the producing countries. A cheap, pure input, increasingly demanded by the U.S. market. They transported the money in secret pockets sewn into the seams of their jackets. A rudimentary, but effective technique. They avoided migration controls, bribed border agents, and used low-profile land routes. These were the first steps of a business that, in less than a decade, would turn Colombia into the main exporter of cocaine on the planet. Ambition grew, and with it, so did the risk. On the 9th of June 1976, the cousins made a mistake. That day, undercover agents of the Administrative Department of Security, DAS, intercepted Gustavo Gaviria and Pablo Escobar in an ice cream shop in Itagüí, Antioquia. They had been following them from Pasto, the capital of the Department of Nariño, near the border with Ecuador, where they had apparently picked up a shipment. After several days of surveillance, the operation culminated at La Playa ice cream shop, where the cousins were caught with no chance of escape. They carried 39 pounds of cocaine hidden in the spare wheel of a truck, a concealment method that already hinted at the level of sophistication that was to come. In addition to the two leaders, 4 more people were arrested, including Mario Genao Vallejo, Escobar's brother-in-law. The operation included the seizure of 3 vehicles, large sums of cash, and false documents linking the detainees to multiple identities. The blow was not only the first major capture of both men. It was also the first serious judicial record of an organized network beginning to take shape as a structured cartel. Gustavo and Pablo were transferred to prison, facing drug trafficking charges. They spent a little more than 3 months in detention, but thanks to legal maneuvers, strategic bribes, and contacts within the judicial apparatus, they regained their freedom. From that moment on, the business changed scale. Trips multiplied. Routes diversified. Contacts in Peru, Bolivia, and Panama were consolidated. And with them, the first major Colombian drug trafficking organization was officially born, the Medellín Cartel. It was a lesson for Gustavo Gaviria. The risk was not only in transport, but in leaving traces. From then on, his approach became even more surgical. Clean documentation, financial movements without traceability, delegation of tasks through third parties, and most importantly, never expose yourself unnecessarily. That shipment of 39 pounds was not just drugs. It was the symbol of a system that was beginning to take shape. A system that would soon scale to levels never seen before. And at the center of it all, far from the spotlights, Gustavo Gaviria designed the economic backbone of a global criminal empire. The invisible lion of the empire. The brief imprisonment of Pablo Escobar and Gustavo Gaviria lasted a little more than 3 months. Time enough to understand two things: that the Colombian judicial system was vulnerable, and that, with money and strategy, impunity was not only possible, it was achievable. They regained their freedom after paying bail and pulling strings within the judicial strata. There were no heavy convictions. There were no real consequences. What for justice was a failure, for them became a warning turned into advantage. From that moment on, the Medellín Cartel stopped being an artisanal network. It became a multinational criminal organization, with infrastructure, hierarchy, and transcontinental reach. What followed was a total transformation. Shipments ceased to transit via rudimentary routes and began to be managed like military operations. Clandestine laboratories multiplied, veteran pilots were hired, alliances with border authorities were established, and a network of political and financial contacts was woven both in Colombia and abroad. Planes were acquired, jungle airstrips were built, entire haciendas were purchased to disguise coca production, and institutions were infiltrated with astonishing speed. Meanwhile, Gustavo Gaviria maintained his low profile, almost invisible. But he was at the center of every operation. It was he who ensured that every dollar had a clean destination, that every payment to officials was precise, and every investment remained far from the legal radar. During the 1,980 seconds, Colombia lived through one of the darkest periods in its recent history. And while Pablo Escobar rose as a public figure first, as a benefactor of the poor, then as a congressman, Gustavo Gaviria rose as the brain behind the curtain. It was a rise in silence. No photographs, no speeches, no spotlight. But with real power, profound and meticulously calculated. Escobar was the fire. Gaviria was the oxygen. Gustavo's reputation inside the cartel was clear. Strict in his decisions, rational in every move, stingy to the extreme, which contrasted with his cousin's extravagance. Pablo handed out bills, financed soccer fields, and gave away homes in poor neighborhoods. Gustavo, on the other hand, watched over every expense as if it were the last, not out of miserliness, but because he understood that money was the true muscle of power. It was not simply about being a partner. Gustavo Gaviria was the architect of money. The cartel functioned like a company with multiple divisions. Terror and hitmen, under Pablo's command. Logistics and transportation, directed by mid-level operatives. Money laundering, investments, and financial control, under Gustavo's absolute supervision. The vast majority of those who worked for the cartel knew Escobar, but only a few clearly knew who the true administrator of the empire was. Despite not being a public figure, Gustavo did not go unnoticed within the cartel. His closest collaborators nicknamed him the Lion, a nickname that, far from being a metaphor for aggressiveness, symbolized his strategic intelligence, his dominant character in finance, and his ability to hide while controlling everything. The lion did not need to roar to be feared, nor did it need to leave the shadows to lead the hunt. Gustavo dominated the board without making noise. And in the world of crime, that is the most dangerous thing anyone can be. During the most violent years of the Medellín Cartel, while newspapers headlined with the name of Pablo Escobar, it was Gustavo Gaviria who decided when, where, and how the money moved. And within that invisible power lay the key to everything: the capital of silence. Gustavo Gaviria's mind worked like a Swiss watch, precise, elegant, and carefully assembled. His discipline was not limited to balances and accounts abroad. It was also reflected in the way he built his personal world. He was not a traditional narco. He did not collect eccentricities for ostentation, but for symbolism and asset protection. His investment portfolio included diamonds, works of art, vintage wines, and high-value properties, both in Colombia and abroad. One of the most prominent assets in his portfolio was Hacienda Nápoles, which he shared equally with Pablo Escobar, although the face of that estate appeared in the media linked to the Patrón. The truth is that Gustavo owned 50% of the property and had direct interests in its operation. His closest lieutenants claimed that his fortune even surpassed that of his cousin. But that wealth was not in sight. It was scattered, shielded, intelligently camouflaged. One of the most illustrative episodes of his profile as a collector occurred during a private auction in the United States. There, Gustavo acquired a ring that had belonged to Imelda Marcos, the famous and controversial former First Lady of the Philippines, for $50,000. At first glance, it was just a jewel. But for Gustavo, it was a symbol. A piece that represented the connection between luxury, political history, and hidden power. A way to store capital in objects that could hardly be traced. While Pablo Escobar handed out wads of cash to children in poor neighborhoods and built soccer fields with plaques engraved with his name, Gustavo operated in the opposite direction. He invested, he diversified, he turned every illicit dollar into a protected asset. It was an exercise in patience, vision, and absolute risk control. That difference in approaches was not a problem. It was the key to the functioning of the cartel. Two leaders, two brains, two ways of sustaining an empire. Gustavo used to repeat a phrase that, over time, became an internal maxim within the circles of the cartel. If you come for lead, talk to Pablo. If you come for silver, talk to me. Lead or silver, violence or bribery, terror or transaction. On that duality rested the balance of the most powerful criminal organization that ever existed in Latin America. And if Pablo was the executor, Gustavo was the engineer. But not even refinement, discretion, and financial intelligence were enough to stay off the radar forever. As the empire grew, so did the pressure. The millions were impossible to hide. And the name of Gustavo Gaviria, though still invisible to the general public, began to appear in the most confidential intelligence reports, the ghost banker. By the late 1982, while the authorities were only just beginning to understand the true dimension of the Medellín Cartel, Gustavo Gaviria was already managing one of the largest clandestine financial systems in the world. According to intelligence reports declassified years later, he controlled more than 80% of the cartel's money flow. It is estimated that during the organization's peak, daily revenues reached $60 million. Not per month, not per year, every day. An incessant rain of cash that had to be moved, laundered, reinvested, and, above all, made invisible. To sustain that astronomical volume of money, Gustavo designed a sophisticated network of structures and channels that went far beyond traditional drug trafficking. Clandestine laboratories strategically distributed in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Aerial, maritime, and land distribution networks with infiltrated pilots, truckers, and border agents. Bribes to authorities, both in Latin America and in the United States. From companies dedicated to foreign trade, construction, entertainment, and financial services. Rural and urban properties acquired in the names of third parties. Planes and helicopters for internal transport of goods and money. And of course, secret bank accounts in jurisdictions with extreme secrecy laws such as Switzerland, Panama, and Luxembourg. It was a parallel economy, a multinational of illegality, operating with the precision of a global company, but without leaving accounting traces. Unlike other capos who enjoyed media prominence or symbolic terror, Gustavo chose a more stealthy path, anonymity as a shield. His name did not appear in judicial records. His face was practically unknown outside the cartel's innermost circle. There are hardly any clear photographs of him, and in the few that survive, he always appears in the background, in closed places, without poses, without visible luxury. He did not appear in the press. He did not give interviews. He left no traces. And that was his greatest power. Gustavo's obsession with invisibility led him to build a personal protection system based on false identities. Among the most documented aliases are Jesús María Rivero García, Ramiro Vélez Vélez. Both names appeared in official documents seized by the authorities after his death. These identities were not simple aliases to move money. They were complete legal tools, with ID cards, passports, bank accounts, property records, and even travel histories. They allowed him to open encrypted accounts without being legally linked to the cartel, register properties and vehicles without raising suspicion, coordinate international trips without exposing himself to Interpol, shield his real name from any operational error. This level of meticulousness made Gustavo Gaviria one of the most difficult criminals on the continent to track. Even within the cartel itself, few knew his real phone number. Meetings were held in person. Orders were transmitted through third parties. Devices were disposable. Numeric codes changed weekly. He was, in operational terms, a ghost. But a ghost who controlled everything. For almost a decade, Gustavo Gaviria was the invisible architect of a system impossible to trace. A man without a face, without a real name, without fingerprints. And yet, he was the one pulling the strings of the most dangerous power in the hemisphere. But no system is infallible. And in the next part, we will discover how the pressure from the Colombian state, the cartel's internal tensions, and an unexpected oversight opened the door to his downfall, the silent controller. In the world of Gustavo Gaviria, the word precaution was not a suggestion. It was a doctrine of life. Every phone call had to use previously agreed numeric codes. Every device was regularly replaced. The devices were disposable, often used only once. And the instructions, never direct, always delegated through carefully selected intermediaries. Even within the Medellín Cartel, considered one of the most hierarchical and violent criminal organizations in history, the majority of members never knew what Gustavo Gaviria's real number was. To speak with him, one had to be summoned. Meetings were in person, brief, and held in secure locations. Armored rooms were used, controlled spaces, and on many occasions, mobile locations. His circle of trust was minimal, reduced to a few people capable of operating under the same levels of paranoia, discipline, and silence. Any break in that chain, a poorly made call, an unauthorized public appearance, a minimal leak, was grounds for immediate sanction. There was no room for mistakes, and much less for emotions. Gustavo did not lead with charisma or fear, he led with precision. On a personal level, he was equally methodical. His life was a routine without shocks. He woke up early. He reviewed accounting reports. He supervised transactions and tracked real estate, banking, and logistics movements. There was only one exception to his almost robotic self-discipline: the cigarette. He was addicted, uncontrollably addicted. He smoked without measure. In meetings, in his moments of analysis, even during transfers in armored vehicles. It was his only visible weakness. A breath amid so much calculation. Those who worked beside him described him in 3 words: strict, demanding, difficult. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His authority came from the brutal efficiency with which he operated and from the total mastery of every detail. Nothing happened without his knowledge. Every laundering operation, every transfer, every property purchase passed under his supervision, and if something did not add up, it was corrected or eliminated. Within the cartel, his reputation for stinginess was not a myth, it was company policy. Nothing was given away. Nothing was wasted. Every cent had to have a purpose. While Escobar financed entire neighborhoods, handed out properties, and sponsored soccer teams, Gaviria reviewed invoices. He questioned expenses. He restricted budgets even for his own allies. It was the only way to survive. Because in his vision, violence had a price. And if it was used poorly, that price was collapse. In a criminal universe dominated by figures who sought to be feared, admired, or respected through force, Gustavo chose another form of power: invisibility. He did not need to be mentioned. He did not need to be applauded. Nor did he need to be feared. He only needed the system to function. And as long as the system functioned, he would remain there, behind it all, faceless, nameless, noiseless. But even the strictest control has cracks. And when Escobar decided to declare total war on the Colombian state, Gustavo knew that the balance had begun to break. Two visions of hell. The invisibility of Gustavo Gaviria was not synonymous with weakness. On the contrary, it was the source of his power. A power that made no noise but ordered chaos from the shadows. In the inner circles of the cartel, it was well known. Without him, the machinery came to a halt. Every clean dollar bore his signature. Every legal purchase, his encrypted trace. Every foreign account, his design. He was the silent but indispensable gear. But even the most precise gears fail when the machine goes mad. The year 1984 marked the beginning of the end of balance within the Medellín Cartel. In March, the national police, with the help of the DEA, managed to locate and destroy Tranquilandia, the largest cocaine processing laboratory discovered up to that time. A monumental network hidden in the jungles of Caquetá. The operation not only dismantled one of the cartel's logistical jewels, it was also the beginning of a systematic persecution against its international infrastructure. A month later, on April 30, the Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was gunned down, a crime that paralyzed the country and revealed the true face of drug trafficking. They were no longer just smugglers or covert financiers. They were a direct political threat. Faced with the state's offensive, Pablo Escobar responded with fire. The message was clear. If the government pursued them, they would respond with war. During the following years, Escobar sponsored an unprecedented escalation of violence. Among the most brutal actions, the assassination of Colonel Jaime Ramírez Gómez, executed on the 17th of November 1986. He was ambushed by hitmen while traveling with his family. The kidnapping of Andrés Pastrana, candidate for the mayoralty of Bogotá, on the 18th of January 1988. An act of pressure that shook national politics, and a chain of explosions, attacks, kidnappings, and massacres that would mark Colombia's recent history with blood and fear. But while Escobar threw bombs over Bogotá and murdered officials in the streets, Gustavo Gaviria looked on with concern and distance. It was not a moral difference. It was a strategic difference. For Gustavo, violence was a resource, not a method. The business had to be profitable, not suicidal. And when Pablo decided to openly challenge the state, he broke one of the most important rules of Gaviria's manual. You do not threaten the system you can buy. In January 1987, President Virgilio Barco hardened the policy against drug trafficking. Extradition agreements with the United States were reactivated, and a military and judicial offensive was launched against the cartel's networks. Escobar's reaction was immediate and ruthless. Explosions in police stations, attacks against journalists, massacres as warnings, selective kidnappings as tools of pressure. It was war. And in that war, Pablo accepted only victory or death. But Gustavo did not participate in that logic. He did not want blood. He wanted control. And for the first time, the two most powerful men in Colombian drug trafficking began to look in opposite directions. That crack grew in silence. While one organized attacks, the other shielded accounts. While one spoke with hitmen, the other spoke with bankers. And when the cartel crossed the point of no return, Gustavo understood that his model was no longer enough to save them. The war Gaviria never wanted. On the 23rd of August 1989, the Medellín Cartel broke any possibility of return. That day, the group, known as Los Extraditables, led by Pablo Escobar, published a letter that shook the country. We declare total war against the Colombian state. It was not a veiled threat. It was an open proclamation of war. A war that counted on more than 3,000 hitmen, an unofficial army, fed by young men without a future, armed to the teeth, and trained to kill without hesitation. And behind them, a financial structure solid enough to finance an unprecedented wave of terror. On December 6 of that same year, 2 attacks marked the beginning of a campaign of systematic destruction. The headquarters of the newspaper El Espectador, a symbol of independent journalism, was destroyed with explosives. The building of the Administrative Department of Security, DARAR, the heart of state intelligence, was reduced to rubble. Violence ceased to be tactical. It became a message, and that message was clear. If you don't protect us, we will destroy you. For Gustavo Gaviria, that was unacceptable. Not only because of the ethical implications, which had never guided his actions, but for something deeper. It was a colossal strategic mistake. It is said that upon learning of Los Extraditables' letter, his response was direct and blunt. You don't need war to win. And with that phrase, he sealed his definitive distancing from Escobar's strategy. For Gustavo, power did not reside in bombs. Power was in well-moved money, in smart bribes, in shielded routes, and in the silent infiltration of the state, not in frontal confrontation. While Escobar drove an unprecedented campaign of urban terror in Bogotá, Medellín, and Cali, Gustavo worked in the other trench. He protected assets, he relocated funds, he moved encrypted accounts, he diversified investments abroad, and he sought, desperately, more discreet schemes to keep the cartel alive without attracting international attention. But the war had already begun, and there was no way to stop it. The strategic confrontation between the two cousins was silent, without shouting or betrayals, but it was profound, and it ended up steering the course of the cartel toward its self-destruction. Faced with the overflowing violence, the Colombian state activated an exceptional mechanism. In 1989, a special elite unit was created, the Bloque de Búsqueda, whose sole objective was to capture or eliminate the leaders of drug trafficking. For the first time, the state reorganized effectively. Military operations were intensified. Cooperation with the DEA and foreign agencies was reinforced. And, most unexpectedly, covert alliances were established with the Medellín Cartel's rivals, such as the Cali Cartel and paramilitary groups. Gustavo Gaviria, who had avoided cameras, microphones, and official records, began to become visible to those who knew where to look. On the 11th of August 1990, around 4 inches the afternoon, a detachment of the Bloque de Búsqueda launched Operation Apocalypse, Phase 2. The target: Gustavo de Jesus Gaviria Rivero. The place: an armored residence located in the Laureles neighborhood, one of the most exclusive sectors of Medellin. An apparently conventional structure, but equipped with bulletproof glass, security cameras, reinforced walls, and hidden escape points. It was an urban bunker, a perfectly designed refuge, a reflection of his obsession with protection. But that afternoon, security was not enough. After years of invisibility, Gustavo Gaviria was located, and for the first time in his life, he did not have time to disappear. The silence breaks. Medellin, the 11th of August 1990. The clock read just after 4 in the afternoon, when a convoy of the Bloque de Búsqueda discreetly surrounded a house in the exclusive Laureles neighborhood. At first glance, it was just an upper-class residence. But the agents knew it was not an ordinary home. It was a bunker. Bulletproof glass. Security cameras at every access point. Walls reinforced with dense concrete. An architecture designed not to show off, but to resist. After weeks of tracking, intelligence, and undercover surveillance, the coordinates were firm. The operation was carried out without margin for error. The agents placed explosives on the main door. The detonation shook the neighborhood. Immediately, an exchange of fire began inside the property. Gustavo Gaviria did not surrender. According to police reports, he responded with an M14 rifle, accompanied by a mini Uzi, believing that the attackers were not authorities, but hitmen sent by the Cali cartel in an attempt at revenge or selective execution. The confusion was immediate. Believing they were internal enemies of drug trafficking, he defended himself with ferocity. The shootout lasted for about an hour. In every room, bursts were heard. In the hallways, echoes of bullets. And at the center of it all, the most invisible man of the cartel, wielding a weapon for the first and last time. Finally, after nearly 60 minutes of crossfire, Gustavo Gaviria was killed. His body bore multiple gunshot wounds. At his side, 2 false identifications were found: Jesus Maria Rivero Garcia, Ramiro Vélez, the same names with which he had opened encrypted accounts abroad, the same aliases he had used to disappear from the radar for years. The fall of the cartel's financial architect was not just an operational loss. It was a symbolic blow. The backbone of the money had been broken. Inside the property, the police found 2 women and a small girl, all unharmed. One of them was identified as Alexandra Tapias, allegedly Gustavo's lover. The other, a domestic employee. The most disturbing fact: there were no bodyguards, no active security scheme, no escort, nothing. Gustavo Gaviria, the financial brain of the most feared cartel on the continent, had chosen to die alone, protected only by walls and by his silence. At the time of his death, Gustavo was only 40 years old, and along with José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, killed in 1989, and Escobar himself, he was considered one of the 3 fundamental pillars of the Medellín Cartel. A reward of $50,000 US was offered for his head, a low sum by today's standards. But back then, it was the price for taking down the financial brain of crime. Gustavo's death left a void, but also a shadow. According to John Jairo Velázquez Vázquez, alias Popeye, Escobar's trusted hitman, Pablo did not mourn his cousin's death. There was no mourning, no commotion. According to his testimony, the Patrón said, "At the moment of his execution, Gustavo was on his knees, begging not to be killed." A harsh account, perhaps real, perhaps intentionally cruel, but one that contradicted everything said about the lion of the cartel. Thus ended the story of the man who built the darkest economic empire in Latin America. A man who did not lead with fear or fame, but with logic, efficiency, and absolute silence. The legacy of the fallen lion. The death of Gustavo Gaviria did not stop the war. On the contrary, it intensified it. The Colombian state ordered a first-degree military lockdown. Special forces doubled their operations in Medellin, and President César Gaviria, unrelated to Gustavo, publicly announced the fall of one of the most wanted brains in the country. The message was clear. The structure of the cartel was beginning to collapse. Gustavo's body was taken to the Jardins Montesacro Cemetery, located in Itagüí, Antioquia. There, in a curious irony of fate, he rests just 15 meters away from Pablo Escobar, his cousin and partner, his son, Gustavo Gaviria Jr., alias Gustavito, and his brother, José Luis Gaviria Rivero, who never had criminal ties and was unjustifiably killed by the National Police on the 2nd of February 1993. That cluster of graves, modest but loaded with history, represents not only the physical end of a family, but the epilogue of an organization that once defied the world. But while the bodies fell and the leaders died, the money kept breathing. Years after his death, a joint investigation between Switzerland and the United States uncovered what many suspected but few could prove. An intact financial network, silent, lethal. Gustavo Gaviria, even dead, continued moving pieces. Or rather, the pieces he had built continued working on their own. According to reports revealed in October 2009 by the newspaper El Espectador, Bank deposits linked to aliases of the Medellín Cartel, including those used by Gustavo, could amount to more than $30 million. Accounts that remained inactive for decades, protected by Swiss, Luxembourgish, and Panamanian banking secrecy regulations. They were not simple savings accounts. They were legal structures, with shell companies, fictitious representatives, and routes designed to withstand international audits. Gaviria had created an armored system, so sophisticated that it survived his own death. Among the names that appeared in the banking documentation was Carlos Alberto Gaviria Vélez, cousin of José Obdulio Gaviria, political analyst, and close advisor to Álvaro Uribe Vélez. In one of the Swiss accounts was found the alias, Jesús María Rivero García, used by Gustavo for years. The false ID with that name was confirmed by forensic analysis after the operation that ended his life. The connection was unequivocal. The laundering system he had designed in the 1980 seconds continued producing ramifications decades later. Gustavo Gaviria never reappeared. There were no tributes, no memory, no redemption, but his legacy was written in numbers, in hidden accounts, in nameless properties. The last Gaviria, the 2nd of December 1993, a few hours before Pablo Escobar was gunned down on a Medellin rooftop, another body appeared in the city. It was Gustavo Gaviria Jr., known as Gustavito, son of Gustavo Gaviria Rivero. He was barely 24 years old. His body was found tortured, executed, and abandoned in a peripheral area of the Antiochian capital. The scene was brutal, but also symbolic, because it was not only the murder of a young man, it was the biological end of the Gaviria legacy within the Medellín Cartel. The circumstances of his death were never fully clarified, but all signs pointed to a group that had emerged from the shadows with a single objective: to hunt Escobar down to his last cell. That group called itself Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, persecuted by Pablo Escobar, a paramilitary and criminal organization, backed by interests as diverse as they were powerful. The Cali Cartel, factions of the National Police, and the Bloque de Búsqueda, paramilitary groups led by the brothers Fidel and Carlos Castaño, and dark figures such as Diego Fernando Murillo Bejarano, alias Don Berna. According to a version sustained by Ora Rocío Restrepo, former lover of Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela, head of the Cali Cartel, Gustavito had recently returned from a trip and was taken directly to the hideout where Pablo Escobar was concealed. The suspicion is that he was captured by Los Pepes before reuniting with his uncle, and that under torture, he may have been forced to reveal sensitive information about the exact location of Pablo Escobar. Although this hypothesis was never officially confirmed, it coincides with statements from former members of Los Pepe and agents of the Bloque de Búsqueda. At least 2 ex-members admitted that the information which allowed Escobar to be located was obtained by extraordinary means. By then, the war against the Medellín Cartel had crossed all possible limits. It was no longer about capturing. It was about annihilating, piece by piece, cell by cell. Los Pepes, born as a clandestine arm to destabilize the cartel, had transformed into a machinery of selective executions, bombings, interceptions, and torture. Medellin lived under fire, and the Gaviria bloodline, which once managed the cartel's finances like a Swiss corporation, ended its story in gunfire, in a grave, and without operational heirs. The death of Gustavito was not just a family tragedy. It was the prelude to Escobar's final downfall, and the final point of a surname that, for more than a decade, controlled the world's drug trafficking economy from the shadows. The end of silence, the death of Gustavito, the kidnapping and murder of key allies, and the relentless pressure of the state and Los Pepes devastated Pablo Escobar emotionally. In less than a year, he lost his cousin and financial architect, Gustavo Gaviria, his brother-in-law and trusted operator, Carlos Mario Genao Vallejo, his partner and military arm, Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, alias El Mexicano. With each loss, Escobar was left more alone, without operational support, without financial structure, without a protection network. The war he himself had unleashed began to close in on him like a trap. On the 1st of December 1993, Pablo spent his last birthday in a hideout. And the next day, he was located and gunned down on a rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood. The Medellín Cartel, once a symbol of absolute power, was officially dismantled. Gustavo Gaviria never wielded a weapon in public. He never gave an interview. Not a single clear photograph. Not a real signature. But it was he who designed the financial engine that fueled a war of historic proportions. If Pablo was the face of the cartel, Gustavo was its brain. Without his vision, without his contacts, without his ability to move millions with surgical precision, the Medellín Cartel would not have existed as we knew it. His legacy is not in the streets, nor on newspaper covers. It is in invisible balances, in accounts still being traced today, and in the criminal sophistication that forever changed the history of drug trafficking. In the world of organized crime, violence leaves traces. But intelligence leaves systems. And as the old popular saying goes, the quietest one is the most dangerous. That was Gustavo Gaviria. A man without a face, without noise, but indispensable. The lion that roared without making a sound. And who, for years, pulled the strings of the most feared empire in Latin America. Thank you for joining us until the end of this story. We hope you enjoyed this journey through one of the most enigmatic and decisive figures in Colombian crime. If you value the content we create and want to continue exploring the real stories that shape the world of crime and power in the shadows, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries. And if you enjoyed this episode, click now on the video you see on screen. We guarantee it will surprise you as well. See you in the